Why did Lincoln entrust tens of thousands of young soldiers' lives to the hands of political generals? For that answer, we're fortunate today to have with us Dr. David Work, who's completing his service as a visiting assistant professor at TexasA&M University in Doha, Qatar. Dr. Work's doctoral thesis on the subject of Lincoln's appointment of political generals won the Hay-Nicolay Dissertation Award last year. The dissertation is now in the editing process for publication by the University of Illinois Press. The members of the Dissertation Award Committee thought that Dr. Work's dissertation was particularly noteworthy. For the first time in one place, a scholar had conducted a comprehensive analysis of 16 of Lincoln's political generals, individually and as a group. Dr. Work examined their battlefield and administrative performance, as well as their impact on politics and their significant contributions to the larger goals of the Lincoln administration. Please join me in welcoming a new light in the field of Lincoln studies, Dr. David Work.
Good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing very well. It's very pleased to be invited to speak here this afternoon. As introduced, I will be discussing why Lincoln chose political generals. I will not be addressing the success of that policy in my address. Of course, if you wish to bring that up during question time, I will address that issue then. As the Civil War began in 1861, President Abraham Lincoln needed generals to command his growing army of volunteer soldiers. One problem he faced was that the United States Army possessed few general officers. At the beginning of 1861, there were only 5 generals in the U.S. Army. 3 of these men were over 70 years old, and none were under 50, the youngest being 53. By the end of April, 2 of these officers had defected and joined the Confederacy, leaving Lincoln with only 3 old men to lead his rapidly organizing volunteer army. And after the summer of 1861, none of these 3 old men would play a significant role in the war. So in essence, Lincoln had to find a whole new corps of generals. Or as one of his secretaries wrote, he had to go hunting for generals to find men who could lead the army he was trying to create. To fill many of these positions, Lincoln turned to politicians, the now infamous political generals, men who received their appointments due to the fact that they were politicians or represented a politically important group, such as the Germans or the Irish. Many of these men lacked both a military education and military experience. They seemed to possess no qualifications other than their political prominence. Despite their lack of preparation, however, Lincoln appointed these men to high command. Thus wrote General William Averill, a West Point graduate, "Now hasten the heedless untowardness of making generals of politicians without the least military experience." Averill was one of many West Point educated men who would bitterly criticize the appointment of politicians, others being William Sherman and Henry Halleck. But to Lincoln and many of his contemporaries, appointing politicians to high command was a perfectly reasonable policy. It made good sense for a variety of reasons. For one thing, there simply was, in a sense, no one else to turn to. There were not enough men in the United States with a military education to officer the new volunteer army. In 1861, the regular army had only 1,100 officers in total, and 296 of them would resign and join the Confederacy, or take no part in the conflict at all. Of these 1,100 officers, 824 were graduates of West Point. So we could say that these were the elite, the military professionals, these 800 men. Of them, 184 joined the Confederacy, leaving Lincoln with only 640 West Point trained officers. Finally, there were another 900 military academy graduates in civilian life, men who had resigned their commissions years before the war. Of these, however, only 114 would rejoin the Federal Army. 99, by the way, went into the Confederate Army. Thus, Lincoln had 754 West Point educated officers that he could draw upon when commissioning generals, as well as colonels, majors, captains, and lieutenants. So there just were not enough professionals to fill all of these positions. This meant that civilians, regardless of their pre-war occupation, were going to play a prominent role in the conflict. It was inevitable. Furthermore, none of these potential generals, including the professional military men, the West Point graduates, had any experience leading large field armies, commanding large bodies of troops. Even General Winfield Scott, the most experienced commander in America at the time, had never commanded an army larger than 14,000 men. That was the size of the army he led against Mexico City in 1847. In the spring of 1861, none of the 754 West Point graduates then in or rejoining the Army had directed a unit as large as a brigade, which is about 5,000 soldiers in a Civil War army. Their careers in the regular Army had revolved around duty with small forces at isolated posts, usually on the frontier, where they rarely saw any unit larger than a company. Even their education had not prepared them for high command, as the West Point curriculum focused primarily on engineering and training cadets to be lieutenants. During their courses, they took only, I think, 1 or 2 classes on tactics and no classes on what we might call grand strategy. Some officers, of course, had supplemented their education with reading and military texts. Some had served in the Mexican War. But as has been pointed out by other historians, in 1861, none of these men, North or South, was capable of efficiently administering and fighting a large army. Thus, Lincoln really had no experienced officers whom he could commission as generals. And politicians, with their backgrounds in party organization, election campaigning, and administering state, local, and federal governments, seemed to possess many of the qualities necessary for running an army, which in a sense is a large organization. Furthermore, this policy had strong historical precedent. We oftentimes may forget now, because ever since the late 19th century, our wars have been run by military professionals, men trained at West Point. World War II, all the high commanders were West Point generals. Today's conflicts, all West Point trained commanders. We would not think of appointing a civilian to command an army. But before the Civil War, that had been typical. That had been the American experience. If you look at the Revolution, George Washington did not have a military education. He certainly had military experience, but not a military education. And none of his American generals were any better. Nathaniel Greene, one of his best commanders, no military education. Henry Knox, a great artillery general, no military education. During the War of 1812, again, many civilians commanded the armies. President Madison, in fact, can be said to have begun the policy of appointing politicians generals. He appointed William Hull as a general. He had served as the governor of Michigan Territory. Stephen Van Rensselaer, who was a powerful Federalist from New York, obviously appointed a general for political reasons by Madison. Both of these men proved to be failures, but their failure did not prevent future generations from adopting this policy, primarily because when Americans remembered the War of 1812, they remembered these successful citizen generals or civilian generals, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. For Lincoln and his generation, the most important historical precedent for the Civil War came from the recently fought Mexican War, during which President Polk appointed civilians to all 13 of the generalships created by Congress. Polk, a Democrat, made appointments that were openly political. He was disdainful of most senior regular Army officers, believing that they were all Whigs and violent partisans who sought to inhibit his prosecuting the Mexican War successfully. To offset this perceived Whig bias amongst regular Army generals, every one of the volunteer generals the president appointed was a Democratic politician. Polk wanted to not only win the war, he wanted to ensure the supremacy of the Democratic Party, because he was certain that the next president, maybe the next couple of presidents, would be the victorious generals of this war. He was, of course, right. Unfortunately for him, in 1848, it was the Whig, Zachary Taylor, who won. But in 1852, it was the Democrat, Franklin Pierce. Not all of Polk's appointees performed well, and military professionals looked upon many of them with scorn. But Polk's policy of making political generals in order to serve explicit political needs was a powerful precedent and would have a tremendous influence on Lincoln, if only indirectly. Furthermore, the ideology of the 19th century also encouraged this policy, as it enforced the notion that specialized training was not necessary for success in war, and that common citizens could potentially become successful generals. Any talented man could have the genius necessary to command an army. Lincoln and his contemporaries all came of age during the Jacksonian era, and it embedded in them, to some extent, this belief in the common man. The editors of the New York Times drew directly on this notion when they praised Lincoln's selection of political generals, arguing that military talent or genius for command are not confined to the graduates of our military schools. The editors believed that success in any field depended on genius, something that education strengthens but cannot create. Other newspapers, such as the New York Tribune and Harper's Weekly, agreed with this assessment. The key, according to all these newspapers, was to find the men of genius to fight the war. This notion was reflected in the hostility directed at West Point. During the antebellum period, many politicians had attacked the military academy, because they viewed it as a citadel of aristocracy that needed to be destroyed. And several attempts by Congress to eliminate the institution nearly succeeded. Similar attacks continued during the Civil War. One senator dismissed West Point as an engineering school and called for the resignation of every man who knows how to build a fortification. This view was widely held in the North. One of Senator Lyman Trumbull's Illinois constituents wrote him that West Point graduates are totally unfit for any practical results. He suggested that the regular Army and the volunteer Army be separated, allowing the volunteers to put down the rebellion while assigning the professionals the task of taking care of the old ladies who are now held prisoner in Washington. Lincoln may have harbored some of these anti-military sentiments. On the one hand, he was a Whig, and the Whigs did tend to favor professional training more than their Democratic colleagues did, or opponents, I should say. And he never made any hostile comments about West Point, and in fact once said that he believed a man educated in military affairs was better fitted for military office than an uneducated man. On the other hand, however, on several occasions he famously disparaged his own military service during the Black Hawk War. He also had little interest in military values, ideas, and practices, and displayed little understanding of the military profession and what those professionals valued. These sentiments certainly led the president to undervalue, to some extent, military professionals, and to believe that civilians could become successful generals. So these were all what we could say background to Lincoln's decision to appoint political generals. What most motivated him, however, was his desire to unite the North behind the war effort. Lincoln realized that the North was divided into different factions between Republicans and Democrats, anti-slavery and pro-slavery, nativists and immigrants, high tariff and low tariff, many other competing interests and ethnic groups. Not all of them viewed the war favorably. As president, it was Lincoln's primary task to unite these often hostile groups behind the war effort. One of the tools he used to effect this was to appoint the leaders of these competing factions to high positions within the Army. By doing so, he sought to cement their allegiance to the war effort, hoping that their constituency would follow their example and enlist in the Army, or at the very least, vote to continue the struggle, without which it would be impossible to win the war. As Lincoln wrote during the conflict, in a purely military point of view, it may be that none of these things is indispensable or at perhaps advantageous. But in another aspect, scarcely less important, they would give great relief. So appointing politicians as generals was a tool he used to solidify support for the Union. This fact distinguished Lincoln's political generals, or his policy, from those commissioned by President Polk during the Mexican War. Polk, as I said, sought only to promote the Democratic Party. He was motivated solely by partisan politics. Lincoln, while never ignoring partisan politics in making appointments, was also motivated by a patriotic desire to create a united front to oppose the rebellion. His actions also were driven by necessity, as they reflected the fact that he was the leader of a bitterly divided nation. Polk could afford to ignore the opposition party, since most Americans supported his war policies. Lincoln could not. There were too many potential opposition groups, too many new factions that might not support him. Thus, Lincoln appointed generals in ways designed to secure the loyalty of three basic groups: his own Republican Party, the rival Democratic Party, and ethnic groups, especially the Germans and the Irish, the two largest in the country at the time. Securing the support of Republicans was probably the easiest goal, since the Republicans rallied around Lincoln when the war started. But maintaining that support as the war went on was something the president was keen to ensure, and also to ensure their support of him personally, of course. And the Civil War would prove an excellent source of doing this by providing a great source of patronage for a president harried by job seekers. In the 19th century, all new incoming presidents had to devote the first few weeks, maybe months, of their administration to appointing people to offices, to members of their parties, to fill all the offices in the government, called the spoils system. The Civil War would provide Lincoln, as well as state governors and other Republican Party members in general, with a vast number of new jobs that they could use for patronage. So thus they could expand the number of Republicans given federally appointed offices, thus further strengthening the party. And the spoils system quickly became an important instrument for filling all military offices, from commissioned officers to paymasters to provost marshals. One could argue that every officer in the federal army was a political appointee at some level. All regimental commanders were appointed by state governors. At least initially in the conflict, all officers were elected by the men in their units. So this was a practice done from the lowest lieutenant to the highest general. As one observer cynically commented, the most important factor in determining who received a commission was which candidate would produce the most agreeable consequences at the next election. The use of patronage in military appointments drew many critics. Edwin M. Stanton, before he joined the Lincoln administration, complained that it gave the war a party direction. The Army appointments appear to be bestowed on persons whose only claim is their republicanism. And inevitably, the spoils system was extended to the appointment of generals. Lincoln and the state governors all used patronage to reward Republican officials, though this system often gave the president unnecessary headaches. After one governor demanded that one of his favorites be granted a major general's commission in the regular army, Lincoln replied that you must know that major generalships in the regular army are not as plenty as blackberries. Lincoln, however, from the very beginning of the war, realized the potential benefits that could be reaped by using generals' commissions to win the favor of important Republican officials. It was an excellent way of securing their loyalty, especially of those men who had not received patronage positions before the conflict. By making them generals, Lincoln expected to garner the support of both them and their constituents. Let me give you a few examples of important Republicans that Lincoln used the patronage on to win their support. Probably the most prominent Republican in 1861 to receive this position was Nathaniel P. Banks from Massachusetts, who is, of course, now best remembered for being whipped by Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley and then almost getting his army destroyed on the Red River in 1864. But in 1861, he was a highly prominent Republican, a former Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, former Republican Governor of Massachusetts, and a man who had not received any patronage by Lincoln after Lincoln's election. Lincoln had thought about granting Banks a position in his cabinet, and many prominent men, including David Davis and Isaac Arnold, had recommended Banks. Lincoln, however, had decided against this appointment, instead choosing for the New England position in the cabinet Gideon Welles. Once the war started, however, former Governor Banks was at almost the very top of the list of new generals, or men to be appointed general. Lincoln received dozens of recommendations for Banks' appointment, and his cabinet viewed the appointment very favorably. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase believed that Banks will make a first-rate officer. Banks' military credentials were never considered when this debate took place. As Banks himself admitted, he was not acquainted with the details of military matters. Such petty little questions didn't matter. Lincoln granted Banks a commission as a Major General of Volunteers and made him the second highest ranking Union volunteer general of the war. Banks' political credentials were too important to ignore, no matter what he may have lacked in military qualifications. A second very prominent Republican who had to be given a position was John C. Fremont. Of course, Fremont had been the Republicans' first presidential candidate in 1856. Before that, he'd served as a senator from California briefly. Still was a very popular figure in the Republican Party. And when Lincoln was elected, he became a candidate for a post in Lincoln's cabinet. William Seward recommended Fremont for Secretary of War, for instance. And Lincoln did briefly consider appointing him either to the cabinet or as Minister of France. In the end, however, neither appointment came through, and Fremont found himself outside of the cabinet. But with the onset of the Civil War, Fremont immediately was placed on the select list of potential generals. Many powerful interests pushed Lincoln to grant Fremont a commission and appoint him to a command in the Western Theater. These groups included Horace Greeley, Governor Richard Yates of Illinois, Gustav Korner, a powerful figure in the German-American community, a group that greatly admired Fremont, and most importantly, the Blair family. The Blairs had tremendous influence within the Republican Party and on Lincoln, led by the old patriarch Francis P. Blair Sr., who had advised every American president since Andrew Jackson. One of his sons, Montgomery Blair, was now Lincoln's postmaster general. Lincoln himself had no objection to commissioning Fremont because it would allow him to grant the Pathfinder a position and solve the ticklish political problem of whom to assign to command in the Western Theater. The Blairs' first choice for this job, Nathaniel Lyon, was considered to be too radical by the conservative Unionists of Missouri, led by Lincoln's Attorney General, Edward Bates. The conservatives, however, would accept Fremont. Thus, with so many powerful forces backing Fremont, Lincoln appointed Fremont to command, ranking him third on the list of volunteer generals. It's a final example of patronage, a lesser figure in the Republican Party. A man named Robert C. Schenck, who, if he's remembered at all today, it's for having written a book on stud poker. Schenck had been a prominent Whig. He had served in the U.S. House of Representatives throughout the 1840s. He spent the 1850s working as a lobbyist for various railroads, and then in 1859 joined the Republican Party. He actively campaigned for Lincoln during the 1860 presidential election, speaking throughout the Midwest as well as in New York. And he fully expected to be rewarded for his efforts. He actively sought a patronage position. And Lincoln was eager to provide for Schenck, as he put it. And he actually thought of offering him a position in his cabinet. Schenck had the backing of Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, but the cabinet position went to Ohio's other senator, Salmon P. Chase. Unable to grant Schenck a position in the cabinet, Lincoln made an effort to have Schenck fill Chase's vacant Senate seat. But the Chase faction in Ohio objected. They felt that Schenck was a latecomer to the Republican Party and not deserving of such a prominent reward. Lincoln also thought of recommending Schenck for a diplomatic post. This, too, failed to materialize, and by the end of March, Schenck was without a position within the new administration, which left him bitter, as he said he had been put aside. The Civil War, however, finally gave Lincoln the opportunity to reward Schenck for his help during the 1860 election. Once the war commenced, Schenck quickly let it be known that he would like an appointment as a brigadier general, writing to both Lincoln and Ohio Governor Merriam Dennison requesting such a commission. In mid-May, Lincoln met with Schenck in the White House and personally offered him the appointment, commenting that he was sure Schenck would succeed at it. According to Chase, Schenck was the president's personal preference to receive one of the first brigadier general appointments, and Schenck did receive this appointment in June. So we can see how Lincoln used the political or appointing generals as a patronage source. If rewarding Republicans was one reason for making political generals, an even more important rationale was to secure the loyalty to the Union's cause of members of the Democratic Party. In the 1860 election, the Democracy, as they called themselves, won 44.7% of the Northern vote. Thus, the North was divided politically, a division that could prove to be fatal if the Democrats chose not to support Lincoln's war policies. The president understood this situation and realized that he could not ignore the Democratic Party after the attack on Fort Sumter. As he wrote in 1862, the administration could not even start in this without assistance outside of its party. It was mere nonsense to suppose a minority could put down a majority in rebellion. Many Republicans understood this fact. Republican Congressman Albert Riddle of Ohio argued that some Democrats had to receive commissions because the war was a purely national, not a Republican contest. Justice to the Democrats, Riddle concluded, as well as sound policy, demanded that they should not be discriminated against. Fortunately for Lincoln and his party, large numbers of Democrats agreed with his course of action immediately following the opening of hostilities and rushed to the defense of the Union. But Lincoln needed to ensure their continued support for the war effort after this initial burst of patriotism dissipated, as it would inevitably do. To do this, he conferred generals' commissions on many prominent Democrats. It was an important method used by Lincoln to unite the North behind the war effort. Again, a few examples of this. One of the most prominent Democrats to receive a commission was John A. Dix of New York. Dix had accumulated a stellar resume of public service. He had served as New York State's Adjutant General, Secretary of State, and Postmaster. He had spent a term in the Senate as the New York representative in the Senate. Following the election of Lincoln, Dix, a Southern sympathizer but staunch Unionist, entered President Buchanan's cabinet in its last few months in office and became a national hero for his order to Treasury Department officials in New Orleans. As he said, if anyone attempts to haul down the American flag, shoot him on the spot. Dix's service as the Secretary of Treasury won him the praise not only of Democrats, but of many prominent Republicans, including New York's Governor Edwin Morgan. Thus, once the war commenced in earnest, Dix immediately became a major candidate to become a general. Morgan commissioned Dix as a general, as one of two generals in command of New York State's militia forces. And Lincoln, seeing this happen, would immediately seize on this and then appoint Dix as a general in the U.S. volunteer forces. In fact, he made Dix the highest-ranking volunteer officer of the war, which obviously was done for very political purposes. As Lincoln could say, look, I got this Democrat, he's my highest-ranking general. Another prominent Democrat Lincoln appointed in the spring of 1861 was Benjamin F. Butler. Butler, of course, had served in the Massachusetts legislature and in the Massachusetts Senate. He was famous at the 1860 Democratic Party convention in Charleston. He voted 57 times for Jefferson Davis to be the party's presidential nominee because he believed that Davis was the only man who could unite the two sections. Though Butler sympathized with the South, he did not support secession and immediately pledged his loyalty following the attack on Fort Sumter. Butler had served in the Massachusetts militia, holding the rank of brigadier general. The militia did little but participate in holiday parades. But Butler's high position within it meant that he had an excellent chance of commanding its first troops that went to Washington. In order to secure this appointment, Butler brought political pressure upon Governor John Andrew, asking Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson to telegraph the governor that Butler should be given the command. This pressure and Andrew's desire to create a united front by appointing a prominent Democrat to command the state's troops led to Butler's appointment. Butler's aggressive actions in Annapolis and Baltimore in April, as well as his Democratic credentials, impressed Lincoln, who commissioned Butler into the national service, making him the fourth highest-ranking volunteer general of the conflict. The final example of a Democrat comes from Illinois, Lincoln's home state, and Lincoln appointed a lot of political generals from Illinois. Johnnie Mcclendon may have been the most famous during the war. Mcclendon had served 3 terms in the Illinois legislature and 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, in which he had oftentimes fought with Abraham Lincoln, who opposed him as a Whig. Nevertheless, Even before the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter, he pledged his loyalty to not only the Union, but to Abraham Lincoln. And once the war commenced, McClendon worked actively with Illinois Governor Richard Yates to ensure that southern Illinois, known as Egypt, stayed in the Union. That region, there was talk of it seceding and joining with the Confederacy. McClendon traveled to Egypt, helped gain control of all commercial traffic and prevent stores from being shipped into the South. He then used his prestige in the area to urge its citizens to remain loyal. Then he traveled throughout the rest of Illinois, calling on people to rise above partisanship until the war was over. Finally, he journeyed to Washington to confer with Lincoln about various war-related issues. All of these activities made McClendon a leading candidate for a general's commission. He had the support of the entire Illinois congressional delegation and Lincoln personally, who viewed favorably McClendon's great energy and industry. And of course, the president especially viewed favorably McClendon's influence in the crucial region of Egypt. So, in August 1861, Lincoln personally conferred on McClendon the appointment of brigadier general. And he reminded the new general why he had been appointed. Keep Egypt right side up. Finally, Lincoln had not only to secure the support of both Republicans and Democrats, but also of the many ethnic groups that lived in the North. In 1860, 13% of the people living in the United States were foreign-born, and over 90% of them lived in the northern states. By far, the two largest immigrant groups were the Germans and the Irish. Before the war, these two communities had played influential roles in politics, as both the major parties sought to win their votes. A fact that Lincoln understood, having lived in a state with over 300,000 immigrants. In 1859, he even bought a silent partnership in a German newspaper. The president realized that the support of these groups would be crucial for successfully prosecuting the war. In the spring of 1861, however, the loyalty of both groups was impossible to predict. The Irish had been staunchly Democrat as well as pro-Southern and viciously anti-black before the war. And though they generally rallied to the Union cause immediately after Fort Sumter, maintaining this loyalty would be difficult in a protracted conflict. By 1862, some influential Irish were calling for an armistice. Like the Irish, the Germans in the early 1850s had tended to vote Democratic. But by 1860, many of them, especially those Protestant Germans, had begun to support the Republican Party. Nevertheless, as the war began, significant numbers of Germans remained loyal Democrats and uncertain about the war. To win the support of these ethnic groups, Lincoln gave some of their leaders generals' commissions, hoping that this would convince these groups to fight for the Union. There were also good military reasons for designating foreign-born generals, since many of them had previous military experience in the revolutions in Germany in the 1840s and in Ireland. Politics, however, was the overriding reason for the selection of so many foreign-born generals. If I remember correctly, Lincoln appointed 12 German and 12 Irish generals. One prominent German that Lincoln elevated to the rank of general was Karl Schurz. Schurz had immigrated to the United States in the early 1850s and immediately became active in politics. He joined the Young Republican Party, ran unsuccessfully for several offices, formed a friendship with Lincoln, and in 1860 campaigned vigorously throughout the North for the Republican ticket. Schurz and many other important Republicans, including Lincoln, believed that he and the Germans in general had played an important, perhaps decisive role in securing Lincoln's victory. And Schurz was duly rewarded with an appointment as minister to Spain. However, immediately following the attack on Fort Sumter, Schurz decided he wanted to be a general, not a diplomat. In late April, he journeyed to Washington, D.C., where he talked war with Lincoln. The German proposed that he travel to New York City and raise a brigade of cavalry from among the city's German population, and Lincoln eagerly assented, granting Schurz a 3-month leave from his diplomatic post and promising him that if you succeed, you shall be brigadier general. Schurz raised his brigade, but Lincoln was unable to fulfill his promise because Seward insisted that Schurz undertake his mission to Madrid. Schurz obviously found diplomacy boring, because by the beginning of 1862, he was back in the United States and demanding a general's position. The German had the support of Secretary of the State Chase, who believed Schurz's appointment would be a decided benefit to the administration. And the president this time relented. He may have preferred to see Schurz return to Spain, but he also did not want to antagonize the influential German. So hoping to retain both Schurz's and German support for the war, Lincoln granted him his coveted commission. Finally, as an example of an Irish general, Lincoln appointed one of his old political appointments from Illinois, James Shields. He was probably most famous for having almost fought a duel with Lincoln back in the early 1840s. The Irishman had served at one term in the Illinois Assembly and had held several other state offices. During the Mexican War, he was one of Polk's Democratic generals that I mentioned earlier. He fought with distinction in Mexico and received a near-fatal wound. He used this service to win election to one term in the U.S. Senate from Illinois and one term from Minnesota, where he moved in the early 1850s. Incidentally, he would win a third Senate seat from Missouri, I believe it was, in the 1870s, the only man to serve as U.S. Senator from 3 different states. Little useless trivia for you. By 1861, Shields was living in San Francisco. When the Civil War began, he was a logical candidate to receive a volunteer general's commission. Prominent Democrat, military experience, who could ask for more? But the effort to appoint Shields met with several obstacles. The first attempt was initiated by several prominent men, including Senator Milton Latham of California, James Denver, a prominent Democrat in California, and Johnnie Mcclendon, all of whom supported Shields' selection. Lincoln agreed and issued the appointment in August. Shields, now living in Mexico, did not receive notice of his commission until October. And he turned down the appointment, claiming that his old war injuries prevented him from performing the task required. 2 months later, however, Shields, his health obviously improved, had changed his mind and had accepted the appointment. But comments he had made the year before almost denied him a commission. Shields had stated publicly in the fall of 1860 that if a sectional struggle occurred, my part will be taken with the South. These comments led several important individuals, such as Senator James McDougal of California, to oppose Shields' appointment because they thought he was disloyal. With these charges swirling about, in early January 1862, Shields arrived in Washington, D.C., and met with Lincoln and Seward, determined to prove his loyalty. he convinced both of them that he was willing to provide self-sacrificing cooperation with the government to save the Union. Lincoln and Seward came away from the meeting with hearty and unreserved confidence in the Irishman, and the President reappointed him as a brigadier general. So we see here how Lincoln is seeking to create support for the war by appointing men from all these different political constituencies. He pursued the policy throughout the entire conflict, and I have found no evidence of him ever repudiating it, despite the sometimes disastrous failures that some of his appointments turned out to be. Thank you very much. Questions?
There's one over there.
Jefferson Davis had a considerably greater military background than Abraham Lincoln. Was Secretary of War with President Pierce. Did he appoint many political generals, or did he rely on professionalism?
He did appoint several, especially early in the war. Gideon Pillow, John B. Floyd, Robert Toombs of Georgia. He didn't appoint as many as Lincoln, and one thing that distinguished Davis from Lincoln was that Davis ruthlessly got rid of his political generals as soon as they failed. Pillow and Floyd both fled from Donelson, for instance, and were never heard from again. Either their careers were over. Even Toombs, who fought fairly well at Antietam, would not be promoted and would resign his commission. So Davis pursued the same policy, but to a more limited extent, and was more willing to abandon his political generals and rely on West Pointers for the long term of the conflict. That perhaps reflects the fact that although there certainly were political divisions in the Confederacy, and they probably got worse as the war went on, at least initially and for the first year or two of the conflict, the Confederacy was more united than the North was. So Davis didn't have to appease as many different political constituencies as Lincoln did.
Yeah, I have a question. I think you mentioned Butler. Some of these politicians were colonels, I think, in their state militia, and
yes.
With them came companies and regiments of men. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. And, I guess because they could raise men in their own state, being politicians. Do you think that factored into some of Lincoln's, play?
Certainly, it would have factored to some extent. The militias, however, were already organized or maybe semi-organized units in the North. So the political appointees came with them. And I don't think initially, when Lincoln called up for these troops in mid-April, he was thinking that way. But I think as he saw these men coming forward, he sought to secure their long-term support, especially in the case of Butler, by saying, okay, you're a general in your militia, but I'm now going to make you a general in the U.S. service, so that your loyalty will now be towards me and my policies in this conflict.
Is that gentleman coming? Did you? I guess you.
Yes, he looks like he's got a question.
I have a question. Was this an intentional effort to keep Army a weak institution? So, we had very few West Point, basically graduates and all those things, basically to keep Army away from the power sharing?
No. You have to remember as well that the Army was very small in 1861, 15,000 officers and men, which explains partly why there were so few West Point graduates. You just didn't need very many. Furthermore, Lincoln although he appointed many political generals, if you look at most of his key commands were given to West Point generals. McClellan after Bull Run, or McDowell even before Bull Run was a West Pointer. McClellan, Halleck followed Fremont in the West, Grant and Sherman eventually. So the key commands would be in the hands of West Point commanders, and they would command the largest numbers of forces and would to some extent enforce a large measure of professionalization on the volunteer force as the war went on, at least as much as they could do in that limited capacity they had.
Here's a question.
Yes, sir? Yeah.
So I know on at least a few occasions at the state level that there were examples of Republican governors turning down offers from Democratic political leaders for commissions. John Andrew, for example, told Caleb Cushing quite bluntly that if he were to have an officer's commission, that it would be bad for troop morale. Any examples of Lincoln doing that sort of thing at the federal level?
No, I've not seen any examples, and in fact, I believe Lincoln gave Cushman a commission, at least he served for about a year, and he didn't do anything. So, no, but I'm not familiar with Lincoln having any fears of that nature.
I had a comment on a couple of issues you raised. One on I think it was basically a West Pointers war, and because there was not a value placed on economic business activity in the South, the planter class basically went into politics or the military. So you had more West Pointers relatively in the South, militarily trained officers who remained in the Army, unlike Sherman and Grant, who resigned their commissions, which accounted, I think, for, a better performance in the Confederate Army in the first couple of years of the war. On the other hand, I think the fact that the Northern generals left the Army and went into business, helped the Union, because basically it was an industrial war. My second comment was on the political generals and John Andrews, the relationship to approving Butler and Butler's attempt to raise a couple of companies of war Democrats. Andrew refused to sign off on as the governor on the commissions, and so too he didn't like Cushing, because he felt Cushing had been a traitor in the peace conference in the spring of '61. So in a sense, it sort of illustrates that Lincoln didn't hold grudges, in that he used Cushing in a diplomatic capacity, and he used Butler. Now, in the case of Butler, Andrew refused to sign off on the commissions, the colonel or generals, and there was a party at the White House where this is a Lincoln anecdote.
With the Andrew Butler controversy, that had very much to do with patronage. This occurs in the fall of 1861. Butler has gone to Lincoln and said, hey, if you send me to North, I'll raise a bunch of regiments amongst the Democrats. But Butler wanted to appoint the colonels of those regiments. Andrew, like any governor, they held the patronage very closely, very jealously guarded that. And Andrew said, no, that's my job. I'll appoint the colonels. And so that was what the controversy was. Who's going to have the authority to appoint those? And it ended up going all the way back to Lincoln, who had got involved in this and got a little peeved at both of them for wasting his time over this issue. He really didn't care. He wanted the troops more than anything. And eventually what happened was they had created a department for Butler called the Department of the East, in which Butler was using to get his authority. And the deal was Butler will appoint the colonels, and we'll get rid of the Department of the East. And that was the deal. And then Butler appointed the colonels and then went off and watched Admiral Farragut capture New Orleans, which he then occupied.
Lincoln, I think, gave Butler a piece of paper which was sort of semi-official, saying you have my permission to raise a couple of.
Yes.
And there was a party at the White House. This is an anecdote. And Lincoln went over to Mrs. Andrew. The governor and Sumner didn't attend White House parties or functions while men were getting killed. You know, their Puritan attitude. So Lincoln says to Mrs. Andrew, well, Mrs. Andrew, how's that coming with your husband? Has he signed off, those approval of those? And Ms. Andrews said no, he refused to do it. So Lincoln came back with, well, you got to remember, Butler's cross-eyed. He don't see things the way other folks do.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, one real quick one, Fred. Since you introduced trivia, Dr. Work, and thanks you for all these great extensive facts and your data and what they meant. But on the trivia side, what was Lincoln's duel with Spade? Was it in the 40s? Was that political or non-political?
Repeat the question, please.
He's asking about the duel with Shields, about whether it was political or not. It was both political and personal. Lincoln and his wife Mary, or I don't know if they were married yet at the time, but they were married. They had written anonymous articles attacking Shields, which Shields took very personally. Felt that they had gone over the line and had attacked him personally, and he challenged Lincoln to a duel. It almost happened, but at the last minute, Shields accepted Lincoln's apology, and so they avoided the conflict, which would have been fought with broadswords at Lincoln's insistence.